introduce himself to you. You have to wear this or we don't get nothing. So on the speaker thing out there. So, but anyway, you can probably preach loud enough to be heard in this room, but without that thing, it's not working.
I'm glad. Thank you.
We're glad to have you. You take as long as you need. But I'm leaving about lunchtime, all right?
Well, I'm glad to be here. Man, this is a big pulpit now. But I pound on it, bang on it, and I appreciate the ministry of Pastor Moeller. Thanks for the invitation. And I know a lot of people here, and I'm glad to be here. I got a couple of bankers here that I deal with, and then I am so glad to see my dear friends, Pastor Lowell and Carol Spencer. And you know what? When I was just a kid, he was already a preacher. And, I got to thinking when I saw him walk in, I can't sing at all. My brothers both can, but I can't sing. And I was in a Billy Graham crusade in the Metrodome. And I had some guys with me. And they said to me, now, Marty, if you sing like you normally sing, we're not sitting here. I said, listen, guys, I'll give it my best shot. So when they left to take care of whatever they had to do, there was a lady in front of me and her husband. And I said to her, you want to make $20 or $10? She said, doing what? I said, all you got to do is when Cliff Barrows has a stand, about halfway through the first verse, you turn around and look at me and say, sir, you got the greatest voice I have ever heard. Where'd you get your training? She said, that's all I got to do. I said, here's the $10. And so my guys came back. There was about 6 of them. They said, you remember what you promised us. You're not going to sing loud. I said, I'll give it my best shot. So about halfway through the first verse, I'm standing there singing to the top of my lungs. And that lady turned around and she said, sir, you got the greatest voice I have ever heard. Where'd you get your training? And I said nothing to them about what I had done. Well, that worked so good that I was asked to preach at Eaton Baptist Temple. I don't know if you remember this. And my brothers and Katie were asked to sing. And my brother Matt said to me, he said, Marty, he said, if you're going to sing like you normally do, we're not sitting here. I said, well, I'll try. And so they went to set up their sound equipment. And there was a lady sitting in front of me. I said, you want to make $10? She said, doing what? I said, all you got to do is about halfway through the first verse, turn around and say to me, sir, you got the greatest voice I have ever heard. Where'd you get your training? She said, that's it. I said, here's the $10. So my brothers came back and Katie, and my one brother said, remember what you promised us? I said, I'll try. About halfway through the first verse there at Brother Spencer's church, she turned around and said, sir, you have a terrible voice. Here's your $10 back. What could I say? Well, I'm glad to see Aaron and Jenny too, and glad to see Jerica. And I'm glad my mom is traveling with me. My wife fell and broke her hip. And so we drove out here last night. She said, she's getting better, and we drove out here last night. She said, if there's no steps, I may come. But she decided against it. And if the Lord allows us to both live until June 11th, we'll have been married 50 years. And I thank the Lord for her and her part in our ministry. And then my mom, I won't tell you how old my mom is, but her and my dad will celebrate their 73rd wedding anniversary in June. And my dad is at Arbor Trace in a cherished care unit, and my mom's in assisted care. And so I'm glad she got to come with me. And I want you to open your Bibles, if you would, to Psalm chapter 39. Pastor Scott, thank you again for the wonderful privilege you've given me. And Pastor Scott and I and Harold Crank and Aaron Hoppy, we used to play softball. Now, I can tell that you don't quite feel that Harold could ever play softball, but he could. And it's good to see all of you again. You know, I want to share a passage of Scripture from Psalm chapter 139 using an experience I just went through. On October the 8th, or the 7th, it was a Wednesday, both my wife and I were diagnosed with COVID-19. And I remember standing there and saying to myself, this is going to kill her. She has pre-existing conditions, has been disabled for a number of years, and I stood there that day there at Elder Bierman, the old Elder Bierman store, and thought, this is going to kill her. Well, as it turned out, her symptoms were asymptomatic. But it took me, a guy that doesn't even take an aspirin, and it beat me up like an old drum. And the next day, on October the 8th, which was a Thursday, I had a coughing spell toward the end of the day, and it felt like my chest was going to explode. It felt like my lungs were going to fly out of my body. And then I started spitting up blood. And I thought, I better check this out. So I had my daughter take me to the hospital. She couldn't go in because of the COVID restrictions. So I went in and they admitted me to Reed Healthcare. And that was a Thursday. On Saturday, I had another coughing spell. This one lasted about an hour and a half. The same scenario. My chest felt like it was going to explode. My lungs felt like they were going to fly out of my body. I was spitting up blood. And I don't know this doctor's name. Never saw him before. But he walked by. He wasn't suited up to walk into the room of a COVID patient. But he opened my door and he said, you're going to ICU. And so on Saturday, October 10th, they put me into ICU there at Reed Healthcare. And I don't remember another thing until November the 19th. I ended up being in the hospital for 77 days. I had to be on a ventilator for 37 days. I was on a trach for 29 days. When I went into rehab, I started to wake up on about November the 19th. And they put me in rehab on the 23rd of November, and I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk. I couldn't breathe on my own. I couldn't swallow. And they took me by ambulance from St. Vincent's Hospital. On October the 16th, I had actually been life-flighted from Reed Hospital to St. Vincent's. That's probably saved my life. Not that Reed is not a good hospital, but they were able to do some things at St. Vincent's that they couldn't do at a regional hospital. And when they life-flighted me from Reed to St. Vincent's, my oxygen level, I was not awake, I was in a coma, but I was told that my oxygen level was under 60. And that all my vitals pointed to the fact that actually a lady walked up to me several weeks ago at Hillcrest, the church that I pastored for 20 years, came up to me, and she was a retired nurse at Reed, and she said, Pastor Holman, she said, I'm so glad to see you. She said, when they loaded you on the helicopter, the guy that loaded you on the helicopter was a Hillcrest guy. Probably shouldn't have done this, but he called me and he was crying, and he said to me, he said, Christy, Pastor Holman's never going to make it to Indianapolis. Said, I don't know why he's made it this far. And when he relayed to me what your vitals were as a nurse, I agreed. You probably wouldn't live. You know, one of the things that the Lord did, when they put the ventilator down me, they pierced my esophagus. And they didn't have a surgeon that could repair that. It's one of the reasons they life-flighted me to Indy. But when they got me to Indy, they prepared me for surgery. And again, I'm in a coma. This is all that I've been told. They prepared me for surgery, and so they took me off the helicopter, and they took me right into the surgery room, and the surgeon was there waiting on me. And he examined me, and he said, you know what, I don't know what's going on here, but they either misdiagnosed him at Reed, or a power greater than myself already took care of the problem, because the hole was gone. And I stand here today, I thank the Lord that he allowed me to live. Probably am fortunate I'm alive. I tell folks now I'd rather be seen than viewed. But the truth of the matter is God kept me alive. I don't know all the reasons for it. I had a family call me from northern Ohio about a month ago, and I had a friend. They were members of the first church that I pastored up in the Toledo area. And he was my age. He was 70. And he had just died of COVID. He was on a ventilator for 30 days, not quite as long as I was. But when they took him off the ventilator and put him on a trach, he died. And his daughter, Shelley, called me and she said, Pastor Holman, would you do my dad's funeral? I said, Shelley, I'd be glad to. And so we drove up to do that funeral, and Shelley took me aside and she said, Pastor Holman, can I ask you a question? I said, okay, I'll be glad to try to answer it. And she said, Pastor Holman, why do you think God took my dad and left you here? I said, Shelley, and she wasn't being mean, just a normal question from a young lady that just lost her dad. I said, Shelley, I honestly can't answer that question. I said, God's sovereign, he's in control, we can trust him. But I'll tell you this, Shelley, he got the promotion and I got the demotion. I don't know why God left me here. But I do know this, and this is what I want to share with all of us today. God is always at work in our life. And one of the things that, as I was in rehab, one of the things I thought about is, boy, there's a lot of things we take for granted, don't we? I mean, here's one thing. Don't we take our health for granted? Well, man, we take our health for granted. I remember when I was a kid preacher, and believe me, that was a long time ago. I was going to visit a guy, and it was back in the day where they had more than one person in a hospital room. And I went to see the guy that I was supposed to go see. And as I started to leave the room, a guy in the other bed reached out and he grabbed a hold of my arm. He said, "Are you a preacher?" I said, "Well, I am." He said, "Would you give your church some advice for me?" I said, "Well, it depends on what that advice is." He said, "You tell your church that we don't appreciate our health until we lose it." You know, he was right. I mean, I lost it just that quick. I mean, I can't remember when I'd been sick. And just like that, it was taken from me. We take our health for granted. I'll tell you something else we take for granted. We take our family and our friends for granted. I thought about, as I laid in that rehab, I thought about, would I ever see my wife again? Would I ever see my kids again? Would I ever see my grandkids again? Would I ever see my parents again? I got incredible friends, some in this room. I can't tell you. When I finally woke up, my brother took my phone. He wouldn't let me have it. He said, you don't need a phone. He said, you need to get well. Well, when I finally got my phone back, I had heard from about 39 different states from people texting me, praying for me. We take our family and our friends for granted. But there's a third thing, and this is what I want to share with you from Psalm chapter 139. We take the fact that God is at work in our lives for granted. Notice what it says in that first verse. It says, O Lord, thou hast searched me, Psalm 139:1. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. You see that word searched? You see that word known? That means to examine or to dig into. In other words, God could not know you better. If you stop to think about it, these first 6 verses show us that God is omniscient. When I say that he's omniscient, what I mean is there is nothing God does not know. And he said, O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. He has examined. He has dug into me. The truth of the matter is, God could not know you and me better. You are not just an unimportant speck or an insignificant nobody to God. In fact, the truth of the matter is, you are the object of his close personal concern every moment of every day. Because he says here that he's omniscient. Notice the second verse, thou knowest my downsetting and mine uprising. In other words, God knows you as you go through your bad times. God knows you as you go through your difficult times. God knows you when you're in the middle of chaos and 24 hours a day is not enough to get done everything you've got to do. On the other hand, God knows you when you don't have a care in all the world and your feet is propped up and you got a glass of iced tea in your hand. God couldn't know you better. He's omniscient. But watch that next statement. He said, thou understandest my thought afar off. In other words, God knows every thought that you and I have ever had. Think about that. Now suppose my friend Harold Crank had a thought. Now I realize that's highly unlikely. But work with me here, wouldn't you? Suppose he had a thought. You might see the thought as it enters his brain because his face will light up. You might see the thought as it exits his brain because he communicates it through his word, his words. But you and I cannot see, nor can we understand what happens between the entrance and the exit. But watch this, God can. God knows every thought that you and I have ever had. God not only knows our thoughts, but notice the next statement. He says, thou compassest my path and my lying down. That word compasseth is the idea of sifting wheat. Did you ever sift wheat? I think the idea here is that not only does he understand and know every thought that you have ever had, but God also knows the motives behind all of our actions. Because watch what the last part of the verse says. He's acquainted with all of our ways. How can he do that? Because he's omniscient. There is nothing he does not know. He understands every thought I have ever had. He knows the motives behind every action that I have ever had. And then look at verse 4. He says, for there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it all together. Every thought, every motive. He knows every word I've ever had. Listen, here's how much God knows. This blows my mind. God knows every word of every language of every human being on every continent, every moment of every day. Why? Because he's omniscient. There is nothing he does not know. And then he says, thou hast beset me behind and before. See that word beset? That word beset means to be hemmed in. Most of us here that have any age to us have had the experience of having our back up against the wall and not knowing what in the world we were going to do. How in the world am I going to get out of this? I remember in the hospital, I wasn't completely awake. I was coming to a little bit. I was heavily sedated. And the nurse did not realize that I was awake at all. And I heard her say to another nurse, it was the middle of the night, and I heard her say, he's never going to make it to the morning. And I lay there that night thinking, what in the world is going on? I'm not going to make it to the morning. And there's not a person here that hasn't at some time in your life had your back up against the wall and you've said, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to make it? And that's the word he uses here. He says, for thou hast beset me behind and before. But watch this. But even then his hand is upon me. God is omniscient. There's nothing that God does not know. Look at verse 6. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. He said, this blows my mind. What does those first six verses teach us about God? They teach us that he's omniscient. There is nothing he does not know. And then you move into verse 7 down through verse 12. And when you read these verses tell us that not only is God omniscient, but God is omnipresent. There is no place where God is not. In fact, he says in verse 7, whether shall I go from thy spirit, or whether shall I flee from thy presence? Can you imagine trying to get away from one who's everywhere? Isn't that what Jonah did? Jonah attempted to flee from the presence of God. You know what? He found out the hard way you can't do it. Because God is not only omniscient, there is nothing he does not know. But God is also omnipresent. There's no place where God is not. And then he says in verse 8, if I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. Circle that word thou. In the Hebrew, it's abrupt. It's emphatic. And then he says, if I make my bed in hell, behold, thou, again abrupt, emphatic, thou art there. There's no place where God is not. And then notice verse 9. If I take the wings of the morning. When we got out of the car out here in front of your building, my mom said, oh, it's such a beautiful day. You could watch the rays of the sun as they poke their up over the rim of the world. And he's talking about those rays of the sun. Do you know that if we could travel at the speed of light? You know how I learned to pray? I learned to pray as a kid being in a car that Harold Crank drove. You learn to pray real quickly. Only guy I know drives fast. But if you could drive at the speed of light, it'd take you 2 seconds to get to the moon. And when you got there, thou, God, would be there. Because there's no place where God is not. And if you could travel at the speed of light, it would take you 4 years to get to the nearest star, the Alpha Centauri. And when you got there, God would be there. Because there's no place where God is not. He's omnipresent. Look at the last part of verse 9. And dwell in the uttermost part of the sea. Now I got to tell you, I'm not a fisherman. One time I went fishing off the coast of Costa Rica. I was in Costa Rica preaching for several days in November of 1992. And one of those guys wanted to take me out into the ocean. Man, the further we went out into the ocean, it seemed like we became engulfed by the ocean, and the more insignificant I became. And the point here is in those insignificant moments in our life, God is still part of our life. He's still present. Because there's no place where God is not. And even in those insignificant times, verse 10 says, His hand is upon us. And look at verses 11 and 12. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. Do you ever have someone say, I'm going to do this in the darkness and no one will ever know? That's not true, because even the darkness is not dark to the Lord. They are both the same to Him. These verses teach me that God is not only omniscient, there is nothing He does not know, but God is also omnipresent. There's no place where God is not. And then you move into verse 13. And here's what we see about God, that God is not just omniscient, God is not only omnipresent, but God is also a caring God. Do you know that it would take someone who knows us and is near us to be intimately involved in the making of us? There are 24 verses in this psalm, and all 24 verses link us, God's creation, to Him, the Creator. And verse 13 says, for thou hast possessed. See that word thou? It's abrupt. It's direct. It was God and God alone that created you. You are not here because of Mother Nature. You are not here because some stork dropped you off. It was God and God alone. Verse 13, for thou, God, and you alone hast possessed. That word possess means to form. You have formed my reins. That word reins is an old English word that talks about what's on the inside of us. The lungs, the kidneys, the heart, the liver. It was God and God alone that formed me, beginning from the inside out. Thou hast covered me. The idea there is it was God who weaved me together in the womb of my mother. Some of you ladies like to make tapestries. You create those things out of nothing. It was God and God alone who formed us, who put us together, who weaved us together. By the way, you're not an accident. None of us are an accident. God and God alone created us. And it was God and God alone that had a purpose and a plan for each one of us. I tell people all the time, there's no such thing as an illegitimate child. There are illegitimate parents. But no such thing as an illegitimate child. It was God who formed us. It was God who created us. Notice verse 14. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. Verse 15, my substance. That word substance means skeleton. My frame was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought. Creatively put together is the idea. In the lowest parts of the earth, thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. Oh, that's pretty powerful. You know what that tells me? That tells me that life begins at conception. Embryologists tell us that this is a perfect description of an embryo in the womb. And God's eyes were on each one of us in the womb of our mother. Not only that, look at the next part of the verse. And in thy book all my members were written, when in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. I don't know why God allowed me to spend 77 days in the hospital. I don't know why God allowed me to catch COVID-19. But I know this, all through that process, God was at work in my life. Because his eyes were not only on me in the womb of my mother, but his eyes were on me as I lived out my life. Because it was God who wrote the script. Amen. And then notice what he says. He says in verse 17, how precious also are thy thoughts unto me. O God, how great is the sum of them. You know what? We have to battle, all of us. I don't care how far you've gone. All of us, sooner or later in our life, have to deal with shame and guilt. We sometimes think no one really cares. I'll tell you someone who cares, and that's God. And I don't care what a person has done. I don't care how low a person has gone. God's eyes are always on them. He's a God of love. His eyes were on me in the womb of my mother as well as you. His eyes were on us as we lived out all the days of our life. And his eyes are on us. Notice verse 18. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. And when I awake, the Bible talks about the death of a believer as being sleep. And his eyes will be on me one day when I awake in his presence. I don't know about you, but God is an incredible God. And God is at work every day in your life and in mine. If we'll just turn our life over to him, he'll use us. No matter what our handicaps are, no matter what our limitations are, no matter what gifts we've been given or we haven't been given, God is at work in your life. I have a guy years ago that I met. And he was born with cerebral palsy. And because he had cerebral palsy, he'd walk funny, he'd talk funny a little bit. But Bobby loved the Lord, and he loved to use what gifts he had for the Lord. And so he came to me one day and he said to me, Pastor, I want to teach a class. I said, Bobby, I don't think you have the gifts to teach a class, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put you in a Sunday school class and you can help those kids. Well, every Sunday he would be in his class, and what he would do is on Saturdays he would go and he'd pick kids up and he'd take them to the park and he'd take them to the library and he'd take them to the Dairy Queen and he'd help them with their homework and he'd do whatever he could do to help those kids. And I tell you, those kids loved him. One day the doctor said to him, Bobby, you can't drive anymore. And Bobby's greatest disappointment wasn't that he couldn't any longer drive, but he thought, how am I going to pick up my kids on Saturday? So he'd try to go and do it on a bicycle. He couldn't do that. So I said to him, Bobby, why don't you call different people in church and get them to take you around? Well, he started doing that, but this was an all-day deal on Saturday. He'd have them pick them up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they'd drive them around, and they wouldn't get home till after 5. And it wasn't long until they quit doing it, and so when he couldn't find anybody else, he'd call me. And I have no idea why he'd call me at 5 o'clock in the morning, but he would. He'd call me at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he'd say, Pastor Holman, you don't have anything to do. Pick me up at 8 and take me around to see my kids. It'd make me so mad. There were times I wanted to reach through that phone and grab him by the neck and just break him in half. And my wife would say, don't you be mean to him. I thought I'd like to kill him. What do you mean, be mean to him? But I'd go pick him up, and all day long we'd make all these visits. And we would sing, can you believe it, in the car, just him and I. And one Friday night, I said to Susan, I said, I hope Bobby calls me today. Did you get saved? I said, no, I got something special planned for Bobby. Don't you be mean to him. I said, I'm not going to be mean to him. So the next morning, 5 o'clock, Saturday morning, the phone rings. Now I got a smile on my face. I answer it. Hello, Bobby. Paster Holman, you don't have anything to do today. Pick me up at 8 o'clock. I'll be right there, Bobby. 8 o'clock, I picked Bobby up, and all day long, we made his visits. We went to the park with some kids. We helped some kids with their homework. I mean, all day long. Finally, at 5 o'clock, I said, Bobby, would you make a visit with me? Oh, his face lit up. Sure, Pastor, I'll be glad to make a visit with you. And so I drove out to the edge of town, and I pulled into a driveway. And when I pulled into the driveway and stopped, I started to get out. Bobby got out. Took him a little longer than I did. When he was completely out and had shut the door, I got back inside and I locked both doors. He didn't know what was going on. He tried to get back in, but it was locked. He just looked at me. And about this time, around the corner of this house came a great big old St. Bernard dog. That's the biggest dog I'd ever saw in my life. And Bobby Hufford was afraid of dogs. And I knew it. And when that dog made a charge right for Bobby Hufford, he tried to get back into the car, but it was locked. And he was screaming, Paster Holman, help me. I'm dying. I'm dying. I'm dying. And I'm in that car about to split a gut. I'm laughing so hard. And so he thought, I got to outrun this dog. He couldn't outrun that dog. And that dog came and pinned him up against the car, licking his face. That was the sweetest, most gentle dog that there ever was. Bobby didn't know that. And I sat in that car thinking, thank you, Lord, I got even today. Several years later, I had already left there, and I was in Arizona working in evangelism. And I was back in Fremont, Ohio, and I was going to see somebody in the hospital, and Bobby's mother, Rita, came out of the hospital. She said, Paster Holman, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm just back to see somebody. She said, Bobby's up there. I can't remember what floor he was on. She said, would you stop and see him? I said, I'd be glad to. And I got to the floor and found the room, and when I walked inside, there he was, my friend. Tubes running in and out of his inflamed body. When he saw me, a great big old smile broke out across his face. I went over and I reached down and I gave him a great big hug. And we talked and we laughed. And we talked about the old days, you know how you do. And just before I left, Bobby looked at me and he said, Pastor, let's sing that song we used to sing. I said, Bobby, there's other people in this room. He said, I don't care, let's sing that song. Bobby was like me, he couldn't sing a lick. But we sang it. This is the day that the Lord hath made, that the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it, and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord hath made. I looked down and I saw Bobby. The tears were rolling down his face and the tears were rolling down my face. And I reached down and I gave him a great big hug, knowing I probably would never see him again here. That the next time I saw him would be in heaven. I left, and 2 weeks later, his mother called me and she said, Paster Holman, she said, Bobby's gone. The world said, no big deal. Just a cripple boy. God said, wait a minute. Fearfully and wonderfully made. The world said, no big deal. Can't talk right. Can't walk right. God said, wait a minute. Fearfully and wonderfully made. Notice one other verse here as we close. Verse 23. God's omniscient. There's nothing he does not know. God's omnipresent. There's no place where he is not. God is a God who's caring. If I had time, the last few verses talk about the fact that he's our protector. You say, well, he didn't protect you very well after being in the hospital 78 days. Even in the hospital, God's at work. Even through cancer, God is at work. Even through a stroke, God is at work. I can't explain it. I don't understand it. But God is at work in your life and mine. And now he draws us to this close. Search me, O God. Search me, O God. Know my heart. Test me, try me, and know my thoughts. And see if there be any wicked way in me. And lead me in the way everlasting. Boy, God wants us to take his flashlight of righteousness, and he wants to have us allow him to shine it in areas of our life that he wants to continue to work. I recognize some things about my own life as I lay in that hospital bed. When I went into that rehab, I was fit to be died. My attitude was bad. God had to do some major work on me. I had a doctor, the doctor there at rehab. He said to me when he first met me, and again, my attitude wasn't good. He said, Holman, he said, I see here that you have been pretty active. You still play some racquetball and golf, and you never smoked. He said, that's probably why you're alive. I raised my hand because I couldn't talk. The nurse gave me a piece of paper. I wrote it out on a piece of paper. Doc, I'm alive because God wanted me to be alive. He said, he read that note and he said, whatever. One of the other doctors, after I got my attitude right, one of the other doctors came to me, and it was a lady doctor, and she said, would you pray with me and my husband? And I did almost every day. We'd get her husband on the phone, and I'd pray with her and her husband. Next Saturday, if my wife's able to go, my wife and I are going to be in their home for dinner. It's amazing what God has been doing in their life. But that doctor, that main doctor there at rehab, he came to me. He said, you praying with that other doctor? He said, would you pray with me? I said, well, what do you want me to pray with you about? He said, it's none of your business. I said, okay. I said, God does not want to be your genie. He wants to be your Lord. He said, I'll just pray with me. So every Tuesday I've been doing a Bible study on Zoom with him. And his language was atrocious. Oh, he would. I don't mean bad English. I mean the 4-letter words that came out of his mouth. Susan said, why do you take that from him? I said, Susan, it's not my job to change him. It's my job to share Christ with him. It's God's job to change him. 2 weeks ago, I led him to Christ on the Zoom meeting and introduced him. He lives in Fishers. You say, why are you telling us this? Here's why, because I had to let God deal with some attitudes in my own life that just weren't right. I was angry. I was bitter. I didn't know how in the world I was going to pay for that hospital bill. My point I'm making to all of us is God is at work in each of our lives, trying to bring us to the place in our life where we have no other option but to look to him. And the psalmist said, Lord, search me, O God. Know my thoughts. Test me and see if there be any wicked way in me. Are you willing to do that? Would you stand with me, please? I'm going to turn it back over to your pastor. But before I do, let me ask you a question. If you stood before the Lord today and he said, why should I let you into my heaven, what would you say? Would you have an answer? Do you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior? He doesn't want to be your genie. He's not there just to rub a bottle and make everything right. But he does want to be your Lord. Have you allowed him to be your Lord? With heads bowed and eyes closed, please, no one looking around. I won't point you out. I won't